Welcome, everybody. In particular, I'd like to welcome our virtual audience that's now being admitted from the waiting rooms. Thank you for your patience, and I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker today for the seminar Blindspots in the Study of Political Representation, Actors in Political Dimensions in Southeast Asia and Beyond, by Jaemin Shim, who is an assistant professor at the Department of Government and International Studies at Hong Kong Baptist University, our neighboring university here in Kowloon Tong. And in fact, this is our second seminar series in a row from a speaker from Baptist U. So we've become, you know, the go-to place for our colleagues, in Kowloon Tong. So welcome, and others we hope to welcome as well from our neighboring university. To give you some background on Dr. Shim, he prior to this coming to Hong Kong to BU, he was a Fritz Thyssen postdoctoral fellow at the German Institute of Global and Area Studies, GIGA, and I understand we have some colleagues attending the seminar from GIGA, so welcome. And a Japan Society for the Promotion of Science, JSPS, postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Tokyo. His primary research interests lie in democratic representation, comparative welfare states, gender, and legislative politics. He is currently leading the Global Mass Elite Discrepancy Project and Gender and Policy Vote Trade-offs Project. His works have appeared or are forthcoming in major international journals, including Democratization, European Political Science, Parliamentary Affairs, and the Journal of East Asian Studies. So before I hand over to Dr. Shim, I'd just like to say, after his talk, we will take questions from the audience here, of course, but also from our virtual audience, and I will try to moderate those questions, so please send them through the chat, and we'll try our best to handle the questions a little bit more felicitously than we did last time. We're still getting used to this new hybrid mode, so we'll do our very best. But in the meantime, thank you very much for coming, and we look forward to your talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. I guess I have to share my PowerPoint slides. So people in the Zoom land, can you see the PowerPoint I'm sharing with you? I guess so. Can you see that? Great. Okay, then I'll start. Again, thank you so much for the kind introduction, and good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to some of my friends in Europe. Before getting started, I want to be clear that this the presentation I'm going to share with you is based on a paper I'm co-authoring with my colleague Mahmoud Farah. He's at the University of Zurich, and he will be joining us through the Zoom. So some of the questions, if you ask later, might be able to be answered by my colleague. That said, let's start. As you saw from the poster of this presentation, the key purpose of today's talk is about sharing some systematic review I did in relation to the scholarship, which compares policy preferences between the masses and elites. And based on that, I'll point out key blind spots and also demonstrate major noteworthy patterns with some global examples. And because this talk is held at Southeast Asian Center, I did my best to include Southeast Asian examples. I asked my colleagues like Dr. Fusati or Dr. Open to give me some reading list. I did read as much as possible, like an undergraduate student preparing for an exam, and try to include them here. But I have to confess, my regional expertise lies in Northeast Asia, to be exact, South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan. So it might not be as complete as other parts I'm going to share with you, but still, I hope I can offer some comparative insights for those working in Southeast Asia. So let me clarify what I mean by masses and elites. The literature I have examined is building on the idea of democratic representation. So what I mean by masses is voters, and for elites, they are political elites, largely elected ones. And the literature I examined largely fall into the party politics field within political science. And it goes by a different name. Sometimes people refer to it as issue representation, opinion congruence, policy representation, issue congruence, policy congruence, or preference discrepancy. And largely how the preference of the masses and elites get compared is through opinion surveys. So basically, both public and elites were asked to answer on a set of questions. And what happens is then the mean value regarding that question gets derived, and then it gets compared. To give you an example based on the Japanese case, as you can see here, there are 3 questions regarding whether Japan should amend constitution, restart nuclear plants, or Prime Minister should visit Yasukuni Shrine. It was measured in 1 to 5 scale, 1 being support, 5 being opposed. And as you can see here, the mean value is derived for both masses and elites. And what I mean by gap is the difference between the masses and elites. This is one of the most frequent way of measuring mass elite gap in the literature. So why am I doing this? I'm doing this because congruence between parliamentary elites and voters is it's long known as one of the vital quality of representative democracies. And echoing this, empirical research shows if there is mass elite mismatch, it leads to lower political trust, lower satisfaction with democracy, lower subjective well-being, and also rise of populism. So given the importance of this topic, I organized a team, and it goes by the name GMED, which stands for Global Mass Elite Discrepancy. There are 12 members in this team covering multiple regions, including Western and Eastern Europe, Latin America, Northeast and Southeast Asia, North Africa, and Latin America. And started in 2018 and is composed of 3 pillars. First was about measurement strategies, and this was published as special issue at European Political Science last year. And the second was about looking at causes behind mass elite discrepancy. And this one is now under, is finalized in the edited volume format and is under the 2nd stage review. And finally, and hopefully the second one comes out next year. Book publishing takes forever. It really it requires a lot of patience. The third one about normative aspects of mass elite discrepancy, I plan to start sometime from next year. So as I said, one of the key purposes of today's presentation is to review this scholarship concerning mass elite preference comparison in a systematic way. And I think the best way to do it is through a meta-analysis. And how I did it is first so basically I went to the Web of Search Engine, one of the most established science search engines in the field. And also what I did was I put 4 keywords: issue congruence, opinion congruence, issue representation, and policy representation. And I also narrowed down my search boundary to journal articles and book chapters published in English between 1960 and 2020 in political science. And this resulted in more than 1,000 works. And of course, there were many false positives, so I had to manually winnow out the relevant ones. And then in the end, I selected 111 works. So I coded each works into multiple different categories, and just to give you a sense of what it looks like. Some are journal articles, some are book chapters, and if you want to see the whole list, I'm happy to send it to you if any of you want to see. And I'm particularly interested in the things I missed out. So let me share interesting temporal and geographical trends based on my meta-analysis. First, there has been an explosive growth in the publication in the last decade. So what I did was I divided the publication into 3 different periods. First, from 1960 to 1999. Second, from 2000 to 2009. And third, from 2010 to 2020. And as you can see, the number changed from 22, 15, and then to 74. We were thinking maybe this is a byproduct of publication increased trend across disciplines. So what we did was we also looked at how political science as the whole discipline has increased in terms of publication. So even compared to this trend, the jump we see in the mass elite representation gap scholarship was much more, but twice more than the increase in political science. So we could conclude the explosive growth is not an artifact of overall increase in the publication. Second is the geographical trend. And one thing we noticed is there's a clear geographical over-concentration in the literature. So what we did was we divided world regions into 4. As you can see, North America, Western Europe, Eastern Europe, and the rest. And if you see what happened between 2010 and 2020, empirical works, including Western Europe, took more than 50%. So basically what this means is the explosive growth I shared with you in the past decade is largely led by scholars, including Western Europe. And here is what I mean by Western Europe, 90 countries. And we were trying to make sense of why this regional over-concentration happened. So what we did was we narrowed, so we tried to see how representative the literature was compared to all representative democracies between 2010 and 2020. So to make our comparison, our analysis more comparable, we narrowed down the scope to those countries whose electoral democracy score was beyond 0.5 on average, and the data is from the Varieties of Democracy dataset. And the research shows out of 9, there were 93 democracies passing this threshold between 2010 and 2020, and all 19 Western European countries, of course, passed this threshold, but there were 70 other from different world regions also passing this threshold. So in terms of the number, Western European countries took 20% of democracies passing 0.5 threshold, yet when we look at the literature, it was more than 50%. So the overrepresentation was real. Even if we change the picture a little bit, so we approach this overrepresentation from the point of population, land size, and the GDP, and still the picture didn't change. Western European countries took 11% of the population, 6% of the land size, and 25% of the GDP. So now Southeast Asia. So far, I only could find 2 empirical works explicitly comparing policy preference gap between the masses and elites. One by Dr. Fusati and his colleagues, and one by my team member, Dr. Ufek. As you see, they are both from Indonesia, and I think the lack of literature in Southeast Asia, I assume, is because of the absence of two-level survey in other countries. That's maybe one reason. And second, Southeast Asian countries tend to be not very democratic, especially in terms of the threshold I set. Only Indonesia and the Philippines could pass the 0.5 threshold. There are other competitive authoritarian regimes, but still, in terms of the threshold, only two could pass. So the empirical gap I just mentioned clearly needs to be filled. The field is not representative enough in terms of the diversity of representative democracy, that is for sure. More data should be collected, and both scholars based in these regions, I mean, this means regions beyond Western Europe, and maybe based scholars based in Western Europe also should focus on countries beyond Western Europe. But more importantly, what we want to argue is the regional over concentration led to analytical blind spots at both actor and political dimension levels. And let me share one by one. And these analytical blind spots, we think are particularly critical for global level analysis. First is about overlooked elites. In his annual review of political science review essay, Bingham Powell Jr. noted, the president is left out from analysis of representation despite being an influential elected representative of the public in numerous democracies. So to see whether this indeed was true, we first decide to identify presidential and semi-presidential democracies where presidents are expected to play a key role. And we follow, in distinguishing the three different regimes, we follow the definition by Samuel and Sugar. They put forward two criteria. One is whether the head of the government is popularly elected. And the second is whether the head of the government's position is based on legislative confidence. If the answer is yes for both, it's semi-presidential regime. If the answer is yes only for the first one, it's presidential regime. And if the answer is yes only for the second one, it's a parliamentary regime. So what we did was we went back to the meta-analysis, and out of 111 works, we looked into how many works actually included countries with either presidential or semi-presidential regime. And it turned out 80 works included. And guess how many included a president in comparing mass elite preference gap? Only one, which is 1.25%. Only one work by Jeffrey Cohen in 1997 explicitly examined the policy preference of president and compared to that of the masses. I think this is really critical if we were to have a global scope, and if the literature is going beyond Western Europe and try to cover democracies around the world. This is the geographical distribution of three different regime types. And as you can see, red, yellow, and orange are either presidential or semi-presidential regimes, and they are not like a negligible proportion. And if you compare Western Europe and the rest, the problem becomes a bit more serious. In Western Europe, parliamentary democracies are more or less like 70%. But once we step out, for the rest of the democracies, 70% are either semi-presidential or presidential regimes. Importance of presidents in policy-making process and policy outcomes cannot be overestimated. Because they get direct mandate from people, many presidents are often entrusted with a wide range of executive and legislative powers. For example, they can introduce and veto legislation, initiate referendums, or issue decrees that have the force of law. They can even dismiss cabinet members, appoint public employees at key state agencies, and dissolve the legislature in semi-presidential democracies. Their role is particularly pronounced in defense and foreign affairs. As you may know, in many countries, presidents are the commander-in-chief of armed forces. And also they can appoint ambassadors, negotiate treaties, and manage official contacts with foreign governments. But one would say, do we really have to measure president's preference separately? Can't we just equate president's preference to that of the ruling party? Based on evidence I gathered, the answer is no. For instance, quantitative evidence based on left-right position by Diaz-Homeyer and Benoit, based on Latin American countries, show the president's left-right preference tend to deviate from that of parties. And we collected 14 case studies around the world, and again, presidents deviating from his or her party's policy position is not uncommon. For instance, in South America, President Lula deviated from his party's preference, and for Eastern Europe, in Bulgaria, President Zelet deviated from his party preference. In East Asia, President Roh Moo-hyun in South Korea and Ma Ying-jeou in Taiwan also stayed away from the ruling party during their tenure. And unfortunately, the reason behind why presidents try to stay away from party varies from one case to another. Sometimes their party only has like a legislative minority, so to make things done, they need to get consensus from other parties as well, which sometimes deviates from his own party. And also sometimes president is from a small faction of his party, which means the party as a whole has different preference because they are composed of multiple factions, and the other factions can have different preference than the faction the president belongs to. And oftentimes, if I look at cases like South Korea and Taiwan, sometimes presidents emphasize partisan neutrality. They are elected by people, so they tend to stay away from what their party wants. So the reason really cannot be easily predicted. So let's come back to the Southeast Asian cases. Based on Samuels and Sugar's definition, I could find 3 countries correspond to presidential regime: Indonesia, the Philippines, and Singapore. I have to confess, I didn't know Singapore was a presidential regime, but it is yet classified as such. In terms of the president's power, I draw my evidence from the calculation done by Sugart and Kerry based on 10 different legislative and non-legislative power. And compared to presidents in other parts of the world, like Latin America or East Asia, Southeast Asian presidents tend to be rather on the weak end. As you can see here, Philippines and Singapore and Indonesia. But what I noticed is the Indonesian one is outdated. An important change has happened after 2002. It became a full presidential country after introducing a direct election. And I wonder if that led to increase in president's power in Indonesia. I couldn't get hold of any data, but I assume the power has increased, and it's definitely more than 0.03, which means almost no power. And I also found evidence from Dr. Goffman's contemporary politics paper showing after introducing the direct presidential regime, presidents tend to deviate from his party's position. A case in point was President Jokowi and his party PDIP. And looking into his research, it clearly shows dualism between the tension between the executive and legislative branch. I couldn't find any evidence about the Philippines, but I wouldn't be surprised if there was a deviation there's difference between the president and his party in terms of key policy positions. Second blind spot concerns masses. And here specifically, I refer to non-voting electors and independent voters. My meta-analysis shows only out of 111 empirical works, only 8 distinguish between voting and non-voting electors and partisan and independent voters in the analysis. And 25% only confines their scope of comparison between parties and party supporters. I will give you an example based on Bonscher's analysis of Bolivia. As you can see here, the acronyms are party names. The upper level, they are the policy position of parties with regards to the state and market dimension. And the bottom, at the bottom, it shows the mass level position based on partisan voters. I think exclusion of non-voters, independent voters, or not distinguishing them can be increasingly problematic. First, because of the increasing proportion of non-voting electors around the world. From the IDEA data, the decrease of voting turnout is quite clear, but it is particularly clear if we go beyond Western Europe. As you can see here, based on my 93 representative democracies I selected between 2010 and 20, there were 27% non-voting electorates in Western Europe, whereas the figure jumped to 35 for the rest of democracies. And for a similar story can be told for independent voters. There has been an increasing realignment trend around the globe, which means there are more and more independent voters, and particularly pronounced. This trend is particularly pronounced if we go beyond Western Europe. Again, you see the difference here. For Western Europe, independent voters are 42%, where but if we go to the rest of the democracies, it jumps to almost 60%. So, and more importantly, again, no, before moving to the next part, I want to come back to the Southeast Asian cases and share some of my findings. For non-voter proportion, fortunately, Southeast Asia is doing quite well by the global standard, which means their voter turnout tend to be quite high compared to many other new democracies. It ranges between 75 to 80, and only in Thailand I saw voting rate going down beyond 70%. For the independent voter proportion, I really searched hard, but I couldn't get hold of any reliable data. I could only find secondary literature by Shim, Darton, and Chu on East Asian party politics, and there they say independent voter proportion is extremely high in the Philippines. I'm curious how this is the case for the rest of Southeast Asian countries. Coming back to the general argument, just like we have to measure president's preference separately to that of compared to that of the median voter and the parties, I think non-voters and independent voters' preference should be measured separately because they cannot be equated to that of voting electors and partisan voters. And evidence suggests a systematic difference. So basically, the representation gap between non-voting electorates and elites is larger than voting electorates and elites. And this has been shown consistently through many different literature. Particularly concerning is that young generation tend to stay away from voting. So they are systematically excluded from the mass elite police preference comparison. Similarly, the representation gap tends to be wider between independent voters and elites than partisan voters and elites. And again here, one of my team members demonstrates that independent voters tend to be more centrist than partisan voters. So what we argue is they need to be measured separately, and their preference cannot be just assumed based on the rest of the population. Third, blind spot is about overlooked dimension, overlooked political dimension. I want to explain about what the dimensional approach is. So basically, the extant research has compared mass elite preference on a wide range of issues known to be important to the country at the time of analysis. And they range from issues like abortion, EU integration, gun control, minimum wage, or progressive income tax. And the meta-analysis shows 22% of research, what they do is they just compare the preference of masses and elites without noting similarity between issues or differences between issues. But 78%, they note certain issues are similar to each other. They should be bundled and nested to upper level concepts. I note the latter approach as research taking a dimensional approach. And I'll give you some example based on policy dimensions, which I repeatedly observe. First is about socio-economic policy field. And as you can see here, if I look into which issues are being measured in the literature, there are things like larger tax necessity, income transfer to the poor, free childcare, privatizing healthcare, prioritizing government deficit. And scholars tend to intentionally group these issues together and nest them into upper level political dimensions. And they go by different names like big versus small government, public versus private, state versus market, but they are more or less talking about the same thing within socio-economic policy field. For socio-cultural issues, specific issues include things like affirmative action for women or racial minorities, accepting immigrants, marijuana legalization, and these issues tend to be grouped and nested in political dimensions such as multiculturalism versus nationalism, materialism versus post-materialism. Finally, foreign relations issues, if I look into the related questions, there are things like whether the EU integration went too far, EU border control is important, common EU army, EU level refugee system, EU level healthcare, and so forth. And basically these ones get nested in to political dimensions such as pro versus anti-European integration or Europhile versus Eurosceptic. What about party politics in new democracies? One thing I noticed is the dimensional approach I just shared with you tend not to be applied to new democracies around the world. That is something I noticed, and when I looked into the literature to figure out the reason behind that, oftentimes new democracies tend to be associated with characteristics such as having incoherent ideological dividing lines and having personalistic and or clientelistic party voter linkages. Southeast Asia is no exception. It's often connected to money politics, clientelism, weak programmatic profiles, and a low degree of party and party system institutionalization. And Giovanni Sartori even said, in view of a new democracy's personalistic and clientelistic nature, he said the dimensional approach to politics has no bearing in the third world until mass parties enter the political scene. And if me and Mahmoud look into the reason why this is the case, and one thing we noticed is the literature, I mean, comparative representation scholarship, they tend to build on the responsible party government model, the RPG model. Basically, what it says is different parties offer distinguishable policy programs to voters, and voters, based on their evaluation should judge certain party, and then they get into the government and deliver the policy. So basically, the linkage, party voter linkage, assumes behind the dimensional approach is programmatic party voter linkage, which reflects the historical trajectory of Western European countries. I noted about 3 different dimensions, and they all can be traced to specific historical juncture in Western Europe. For instance, for the big versus small government, it goes back to the early 20th century when industrial and communist revolution happened. And for authoritarian versus liberal political dimension, it goes back to the 1960s when the new social movement was at the peak. And for the third dimension, pro versus anti-EU integration, it can be said it originated in the 1990s as a result of increased pace of European EU integration after the Maastricht Treaty. So yes, they reflect programmatic party voter linkage, but also it reflects party politics trajectory in Western Europe. So despite the fact that new democracies, the whole idea of responsible party government model might not be applicable to many new democracies. But what we noticed is there are many places where long-lasting political division are present. We are collecting a database in relation to political dimensions around the world. And as you can see here, for social cultural political field, religious versus secular conflict is an important political dimension in places like Tunisia, Indonesia, and Eastern Europe. For foreign relations policy field, in Japan, peace versus normal state conflict is a very important dimension. It revolves around whether the peace constitution number 9 should be changed. Basically, that is preventing Japan from rearming itself. It's a very important conflict. And in places like Bulgaria, the key tension can be found between whether one is more pro-EU or pro-Russian. And in many new democracies, the whole idea of whether we should maintain democracy itself is an important political conflict. Think about democratic backsliding happening in many parts of the world. For instance, I didn't include here, but Turkey, Tunisia, and many South American countries, democratic versus authoritarian dimension also is important. So what we want to say here is these dimensions should not be treated as residual, exceptional, or transitory. They have been observed over multiple electoral cycles, and they are amenable to the spatial understanding of political competition and can be verified with reliable quantitative data. It can be opinion surveys, sometimes it can be in other forms like legislative speeches, roll call votes, but what we want to say is they are stable political dimensions. For Southeast Asia, I could find at least 3 countries with rather stable political dimensions. First is Indonesia, which is whose key dimension revolves around religious versus secular conflict. I couldn't find whether this goes hand in hand with ethnic differences, but still, it should be qualified as a stable political dimension. For Malaysia, ethnic conflict is clearly an important dimension between Chinese and Malays, and I could find this goes hand in hand with differences in religion and also class. Chinese tend to be more like Taoist or Buddhist and tend to be in the upper echelon of income groups. For third, Thailand, royalist versus populist also is an important dimension. And this overlaps with regions as well as classes. Royalists tend to be more coming from the central part near Bangkok, and they tend to be richer than the rest. For the Philippines, I couldn't find any stable political dimension. I thought it was between rich and poor, but in terms of the voting patterns or how the president appeals in elections, I couldn't find it yet. But maybe you can give me more input in that regard. So final point I want to make is when we understand political dimensions, they should be contextualized. Each country has a different political trajectory, and when we try to understand new democracies, we cannot directly apply what we know from Western Europe. Western Europe, the political dimensions tend to be created more through bottom-up process and strongly influence what happened at the domestic level. But for new democracies, oftentimes top-down process by elites are important, and sometimes the key dimensions reflect what happened at the international level. As rightly pointed out by Randall, many new democracies lack system autonomy. Very contents of party politics were more likely to be shaped by external forces. Based on our collection of political dimensions, we could point out two major strands of external influence. One is wartime and Cold War legacies, and second is colonial legacies. And allow me to give you some examples of what I mean. First, my home country, South Korea. There's the political conflict. One of the important political conflicts can be found between how one views North Korea. One can take more dovish approach or hawkish approach. And this division clearly goes back to what happened after the war. Division of Korea by the US and the Soviet Union is directly can be directly a contributing factor. Second, for Japan, as I mentioned, the key conflict is between normal and peace state, and it revolves around whether the peace constitution, Article number 9 should be changed. And we cannot imagine this tension from happening. We cannot imagine the emergence of this tension without the US occupation of Japan after the war. The constitution itself, the peace constitution, was created by the US occupation, the US forces, so it clearly reflects external influences. Similar story can be told when we understand what's happening in Eastern European countries. They oftentimes places like Lithuania, Estonia, or Bulgaria, an important political conflicts has to do with how one views Russia. And of course, that political dimension can be traced to their historical experiences, like being a satellite state of the Soviet Union or getting annexed to the Soviet Union in the past. In Israel, dovish versus hawkish stance towards Palestine is important. This also goes back to the British Empire's Balfour Declaration during the World War I. For Southeast Asian countries, I think some of them clearly reflect colonial legacies when it comes to shaping political dimensions. For instance, for Malaysia, as I said, Chinese versus Malays is an important political conflict. And I found some evidence this is related to forced labor migration policy by the British Empire and also growing inequality during the colonial time. For Indonesia, a religious versus secular dimension is important. And I think I'm still not sure about this, but maybe the secular side can be traced to the legacies of Dutch Empire, because the communist part of Indonesia is linked to what happened during the Dutch Empire time. Oh, okay. Then let me summarize and suggest some future directions and wrap up my presentation. First, related to temporal and geographical trend, as I said, the literature comparing mass and elite policy preference has seen a dramatic jump in the past decade. And that is largely driven by works covering Western European countries. And what we argue is the region over concentration cannot be justified because there are many other representative democracies not being covered. Second is about the first blind spot, which is about overlooked presidents. As I made clear, presidents tend to be largely overlooked in the existing literature. But considering how many democracies beyond Western Europe take either presidential or semi-presidential form, and how important presidents tend to be in terms of policy making and shaping policy outcome, and also their preference cannot be easily deduced from the ruling party or the median voter. They should be included and measured separately. Second blind spot was at the mass level, which is about overlooked non-voters and independent voters. And so far, most of the 92% of the literature did not distinguish between voters and non-voters and independent voters and partisan voters. Sometimes they just exclude, especially non-voters. This is problematic because the proportion of falling into these categories is increasing, especially beyond Western Europe, and they tend to have a different preference than voting population and partisan voters. The last blind spot is about overlooked political dimensions in new democracies. As I said, 80% of the extant literature takes a dimensional approach. They compare policy preference between masses and elites on a set of issues, and then they tend to bundle a set of issues to specific political dimension. This kind of approach tends to be overlooked in new democracies, and we assume that's partly because the literature assumes programmatic party voter linkage coming from the responsible party government model. But as I demonstrated, new democracies should not be excluded from the dimensional understanding of politics. They might look different and have created through different paths, but yet they should not be excluded. Okay, final slide. What we are going to do afterwards. First, we want to include more countries. So far, we left out competitive authoritarian regimes, but many electoral autocracies have functioning elections and legislature. So, and also there should be some kind of linkage between political elites and the population. They cannot be completely detached. So we want to include, we want to expand to competitive authoritarian regimes in the next round of meta-analysis. Finally, we want to reinforce and validate political dimension database we have been creating. We only cover like 25 countries so far. We want to include more, but more importantly, we want to validate what we have been collecting. And one way so far is mostly based on secondary literature, but we want to do some expert interviews to understand the origin and the validity between and the continuity on political dimensions we are collecting. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'll stop here.
Thanks very, very much for that. And as I said, for anybody who came late, we'll be taking questions from the floor and also via chat, which I will help moderate. I can see some chats are coming in. Allow me to start out, Jaemin, and ask. First of all, thank you for this overview and ambitious research agenda, and also in particular for your looking at the Southeast Asian cases and trying to add it to this larger data universe, as it were. I can't, of course, as a Southeast Asianist, resist to make a couple of comments. One, Singapore is not presidential, in my view. It's a symbolic presidency. It has very few powers. I mean, it depends. I see why, according to the definition, you might consider it that, but it's a parliamentary system. The other cases, Myanmar was before the recent coup, arguably a hybrid system. Marco Bunta has written quite a bit about that. For example, Timor-Leste is a semi-presidential system, suffering some difficulties recently, but semi-presidential. But I would agree, Indonesia and the Philippines are two crucial presidential cases. And in terms of the Philippines, parties really don't matter much at all, and therefore you could call basically the whole Philippine electorate independent. There's very little party affiliation of any sort. Parties are, as one Philippine scholar, Nathan Kimpo, has put it, is easily disposed of. You can flush down the toilet after campaigns. Their vehicles, so they can't be taken that seriously. There are regional dimensions of voting, but does not overlap with class generally. But regional dimensions are important. Class dimensions are sometimes important, but not always. But anyway, these are details that we'll get into, and I see we have a number of members of the audience who are experts in other cases. They may want to add things. Let me ask you, are there any other questions from our audience before we go to the chat?
Oh, actually, yes. I was wondering, Jaemin, you mentioned how important it is to focus on precedents, and most of the methodology you talked about was about survey methods for political elites, for masses. Can you say a bit more about what is our methodological approach when we try to measure the policy preferences of presidents, especially in places like Southeast Asia, like Indonesia, like the Philippines, where there could be a rather different style in terms of presidential communication or rhetoric when compared with what we can expect in other Western political systems like the US and Western Europe. So that's my one thing I'd be interested in knowing more about. And the second thing you mentioned about some place-specific cleavages, like secular or secular religions in the Indonesian context. In Malaysia, it's a lot about ethnicity. Do you see this type of cleavages as overlapping the kind of social dimension that you described at the very beginning? You said in Western systems we have this conflict about the economy, and then we have another dimension that is more on social issues. So can, say, a cleavage like these ones that you have described in Malaysia, in Indonesia, can be easily reconduced to this broader, upper order cleavage on social issues? Do you see that as being advisable, possible?
Shall I
Yes, please.
respond
Please,
to some of? I'll try to. I'm not sure if I can respond to all, but I'll do my best. I'll start with what Diego pointed out regarding how to include a president's preference. About the measurement. Yeah, it's very rare. The most straightforward approach will be to ask presidents when you ask legislators, when you conduct your survey. But that might not be easy. It might not be easy to get hold of our country's president and ask a number of questions. But still, there are many, especially at the elite level, based on what I found through my team exercise. There are many ways to tap into president's position. For instance, in many Latin American and East Asian countries, legislative branch can submit legislative proposal, but also executive branch, which largely is in line with the preference of the president, can also submit bills. So by examining the nature of bills or which bills get vetoed, because sometimes president can veto bills coming from the legislature too. We can kind of guess what the president's policy position is. And also things like in the US, executive bills do not exist, but I saw people analyzing the State of the Union speech. So presidents, by virtue of being the most important political figure in presidential and semi-presidential countries, they deliver a lot of speeches, and also we can look into what are being said, what are not being said, and derive our policy positions. But what is, I think, particularly challenging is how to merge. If you want to say, this is the preference of elites, it's not easy to merge the preference of the president and that of legislators. I think the presidential power should be taken into account if you really want to merge. But still, I don't know a systematic way of doing it, but that will be a challenge, how to neatly bring the elite preference together. And regarding the social component of political dimensions in Southeast Asian countries, one thing I noticed is, yes, there is a certain degree of social aspect. Many of the dimensions, if I look into when they got crystallized, it happened after the 1997 Asian financial crisis in early 2000. But the way in which it got created was not as, for instance, like what happened in Western Europe. Strong trade union asking for more government intervention, bigger welfare state, or like a large-scale social movement in the 1960s and 70s in Western Europe or the US. Some I would say cleavage material ingredient was there, but I think the political dimension got created by more at the elite level, by them actively taking advantage of it. So yeah, I would say still maybe the top-down level is stronger in new democracies compared to many. Sometimes they shift. What I found out was in the case of Thailand, Thaksin's party was at the beginning catch-all. It was not for the poor, but then in the early 2000s, he shifted and became more like someone representing the poor. So, and I see that kind of strategy shift from the Taiwanese case too. Actually, for Taiwan in the early 1990s, the DPP, which is the current ruling party, flirted with the socio-economic dimension, labor versus capital, big versus small government, but then they shifted and emphasized more on the identity dimension, reunification versus independence issue. So yeah, for new democracies, what we want to argue is elite level initiatives and manipulation is a bit more important. Yeah. Yes.
Sorry to get back. As you can see, just had a discussion with your colleague at BU, Jerry and George, concerning the issue of presidentialism in Singapore. And Jerry makes the fair point that you're right, of course, that the president is elected, and voters have tended to see this as a way to challenge the power of the ruling PAP. I've responded by saying real power still remains with the PAP-dominated parliament. But I think the point I'd like to make is that the additional point I'd like to make is that your idea of looking at competitive authoritarian regimes seems promising, because if we do look at the Singapore case, I think there's no question that that voters are looking for ways, as Jerry is pointing out, that voters are looking at ways to express their concern, even if it's a competitive authoritarian system. That's one way to do so. And there have been some very competitive presidential elections recently, even if real power and primaries in parliament, and parliamentary elections has also become increasingly competitive, even if the system still remains authoritarian. So that is interesting. You mentioned the case in Malaysia. Those political dimensions are indeed very important, because that's the way the semi-competitive system, semi-authoritarian system has worked for decades now. The once ruling United Malay National Organization is at a crossroads, and the defeat of that party in 2018 shook up the political system. It seems to be more moving back in the authoritarian direction, but clearly these political dimensions we talk about matter. So I think those are, in Southeast Asia, those two cases at least are very interesting. I think in the case of Cambodia, again, there'll be experts will know more. Probably the system has become so authoritarian that you can't really talk meaningfully about any representation issues, because there's just no real chance to register discontent in the electoral system, or very limited chances. But I think that's, from my perspective, using the Southeast Asian cases of Singapore and Malaysia, at least, promising research group, and as interesting in many ways as the so-called full democracies, although both Indonesia and the Philippines, we should add, are backsliding democracies now, according to more recent studies.
Great. Okay. Any more questions, or I want to respond to one or two of the comments you made, Professor Thompson. One is about Philippine parties in the Philippines being like weaker parties. I mean, the parties are there for the president, and they're gone.
Presidential vehicle parties.
The situation is very similar in South Korea. Parties appear and they go. And oftentimes parties appear because there are two presidential candidates in one party, and there's a primary, and the other one doesn't want to succeed, and then gets out of the party and creates his own. This has been repeating for more than 25 years, but still, yet there are certain stable political dimensions, like the difference between Southeast and Southwest. Provincialism has been there for more than 20 years. So parties themselves change, but still they can be more or less be labeled, can be associated with certain position of favoring certain region, or in favor of how to approach North Korea, more hawkish or dovish. So I wonder whether that is the case in the Philippines. Even though they change and go, still there are certain ideological orientation attached to particular issues.
Well, if I can, and I'm very happy to talk about the Philippines. Most happy to talk about the Philippines. I think that's a fair point about South Korea, and but the difference is in the Philippines, these presidential vehicle parties are as Kiplo had put it, easily discarded, but discarded also in the sense that they don't correspond to these kind of cleavages, the regional cleavages. So you don't see any political cleavages that have been associated in the long term with particular regional alignments. That said, one could speculate that these may be now emerging because of the Duterte presidency, which is very strongly located in the south, where he's from, the Mindanao, and Visayan, the Cebuano-speaking group, which he's part of, even though his family was moved to Mindanao. So it had that regional dimension versus the north. And then you get this opposition forming around another presidential candidate, Liberal Party candidate, is just trying to return to liberal democratic values, which have been eroded seriously under Duterte. And now that the son of the former dictator is running in alliance with the presidential daughter, that potentially could solidify this.
Okay.
But of course, it's too early to say. But one can speculate that there would be. But you see, the issue of class is difficult because Duterte support has cut across social classes, and even though the support of the liberal candidate seems to be more among the middle class, it is just not significant enough to say it's a middle to upper class party versus the poor, because Duterte also has middle class support.
Then how about social culture issues? He's known for being very harsh on like crime. So maybe the law and order dimension.
Yeah.
Might
Well, that
continue
I think
to be.
I would call it the liberal democracy versus the
Yes, liberalism
The-
versus
the- the-
authoritarian.
The Southeast Asianist Thomas Bapinski described it as order over law. I think that's a good description. Not very much concerned about legal niceties, looking for shortcuts to solve problems like vigilante action against drug users. So we don't seem to have as chatty an audience as we often have. Now that I'm ready to take the chats, not many.
And there's another question there.
Is there? Ah, yeah, there we go. Very good. So the question is, I can't tell who it's from. Just from Jerry again. I wonder if it's adequate to think of religious, secular, and ethnic divides as dimensions. Do they run so deep that they should be thought of as indicating fundamentally different notions of citizen subject? In other words, that the mass in Southeast Asia could mean something different from the mass in established democracy. For those who don't know, this is a question for Professor Cherry and George at Baptist University.
I see. One thing I want to be clear when I say political dimensions is, I'm not equating political dimensions to political cleavages coming from the Western European tradition, especially if you follow people like Bartolini and Mayer. For anything to be qualified as cleavage, there should be organizational difference, attitudinal difference, value difference. It's very strict. But of course, from that angle, many of the dimensions I say are not as stable and not as institutionalized. But I think we have to differentiate different degrees of stability and continuity. From my point of view, if a dimension lasted more than, let's say, 3 electoral cycles and people can distinguish particular parties with regards to particular issues, they should be taken seriously. It's not just like a temporal issue which will appear and disappear. So, and so far, based the examples I gave you, like the Japanese, the South Korean one, they lasted more than 20, 30 years. And so sometimes they do not resonate at the mass level that much. The division appears mainly at the elite level, but that still should be qualified as political dimension, particularly if we consider in new democracies, elites tend to be more important in shaping political conflicts. Even though things are not very clear at the mass level, it should be qualified as political dimension. And that's what I think. So, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I think the other issue that would interest me, again, somebody looking at it from a Southeast Asian perspective, is how this would be not so much comparable to Europe or the US, which you didn't talk about as much, but the US also provides some very interesting evidence, right? Is Latin America or Africa, because you might, as you said, you see some similar phenomenon there that in turn as a whole differ from possibly the North American example. Although if I can say this, so can I just understand your theory better? Let's take the example of Trump.
Yep.
And does Trump? I mean, Trump seems to have deviated quite a bit from traditional Republican principles. Small government, big deficits he had,
and more isolationist in
foreign policy, very huge, very big difference. So how do you deal with a guy like Trump? I mean, he clearly is diverging from the party level, but he in turn seems to be resonating better with the base.
Exactly.
And bringing therefore the party with him.
Yeah. So this is the reason why we have to measure president's preference separately, as you rightly mentioned. In the case of US, if we include Donald Trump, actually the mass elite gap narrows when it comes to foreign policy. But if you see places like France, Emmanuel Macron, he's also an important president, can do many things. But when it comes to EU integration issue, if we include Emmanuel Macron, the gap widens. So far between the masses and the elites in terms of to what extent we should, as we all know, he's very much pro Europe EU integration person. So far, I couldn't figure out, how to predict president's preference. So many things affect, and especially as made clear in Samuel and Sugar's book, many of them tend to come from outside. They don't climb the ladder of party hierarchy. Sometimes they jump directly from outside, and oftentimes they don't stay in politics. When their tenure is over, they go somewhere else. So yeah, it's not easy to predict how they'll behave in advance, but their preference should be measured when we understand mass elite discrepancy, particularly for foreign affairs matters. Yeah.
We do have a question now from your former colleague, Andreas.
Oh, yeah.
You think that MEDs are stronger in presidential systems? Does populism mean better representation of mass preferences?
This is, I think, partly answered in my previous response. I cannot predict. Sometimes presidents tend to be more in line with the mass because they have to get the mass, the mandate at the national level. So of course they should be closer to the median voter. But at the same time, you should think like, oftentimes presidents, they are not there for re-election. Sometimes it's forbidden to be re-elected. For instance, the South Korean case, they can only be elected one time.
Also the Philippines.
And also the Philippines. In that case, they might have different idea in mind rather than to reflect what the voter wants. So far, I couldn't come up with any systematic theory to predict how the president would deviate or not deviate from the party line or from the public. But my point here, our point is we should include the preference of presidents for presidential and semi-presidential regimes, especially if they have a lot of legislative and executive powers in hand.
Agreed, and certainly for Southeast Asia, very important.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think we've reached the point where there are no further chat questions, no further questions in the audience.
I can ask one more.
Yes, please.
Just like going back to what you said about foreign policy issues being like an overlooked dimension somehow. Well, in the Europe, we know that there is this regional integration dimension that has become much more salient. Do you see, like, speculating a bit, something like this also being relevant in the context of Southeast Asia? I mean, not regional integration, but more broadly, foreign policy. Is there an issue as we read like more and more about strategic competition between China and the US in the region, Belt and Road Initiative, this sort of things? Do you see this being potentially one of those dimensions?
One thing I know is ASEAN wants to be like European Union in terms of the level of integration, want to go further than the current level. Is that correct? No? If that becomes the case, I think things like immigration will be a huge issue. People moving from one country to another. Certain Southeast Asian countries are doing much better, certain countries not. Regarding diplomatic stance towards China and the US, I have to say, I don't know much to comment on that. Yeah, I'm afraid I'm too ignorant to say anything.
And again, sorry to do this again, bring up the Philippine case, a very interesting example of the president, quite a popular president, Duterte, who had an unusually conciliatory, or even some people say pro-China stance.
Wow.
And that we know is different from average voters' preference in the Philippines, which has become more China skeptical given the South China Sea deal and so on. But that didn't affect his popularity at all, which is the other issue of what's really important in people's minds for support. So his opinion poll numbers were not affected by that, but in the current election, there seems to be a broader consensus that there will be a stance in the future. But I agree, it's an interesting dimension. Potentially. Right, well, thank you very, very much, also for this interesting discussion, and thanks to our audience, both here and in Zoom land. I like that expression. Should be the name of a movie. Zoom land. I'm sure it's already in the making. But anyway, thanks very much, and we look forward to discussing this further, and all that remains is to express our thanks formally again.
Thank you.
Thank you.